Shalom. We took a break because of COVID and the lockdown, and they were restricting so much about meeting, and we have such a small building, there was no way we could social distance as required. Um, as much as I thought that it was wrong that they shut down houses of worship, um, we are supposed to obey the law of the land. So we were almost finished in Torah study. We were almost finished with Bashiri. And so I went ahead and finished the recordings for that, put them out on the website so that people could get them. I just kind of put the Torah study on a hold because I really wanted us to be able to do midrash. Okay, I don't get as much midrash from the guys. I do some from people out of the area, people overseas who listen, who want more feeding. They write to me and ask me questions. But from the local group, I feel like I don't get much midrash when it's on the recording. So today we're going to start in Shemot, Exodus, the first chapter. Remember, at the end of Genesis, they all the sons of Yaakov, Israel, all came down with their families, and Israel came down, and he gave us blessings. Um, and we had a kind of a prophetic picture of what would happen, not to the sons themselves, but to their descendants, who numbered in the millions, um, down through history. If you go back and listen to those recordings from those chapters, you'll see that I talked some about where the majority of the descendants of different ones seem to have ended up. We talked about the myth of the 10 lost tribes. It was actually 9.5, and we're not really lost. He knows exactly where we are. Some of us are blessed to be able to very easily trace our Jewish lineage. Okay, I can trace mine to Yehuda. Okay, my wife traces her to clearly to Yehuda, and then we also know through family traditions, that she also has some in the tribe of Dan. Okay, there are some genealogy. Actually, Brother Melech here is a kind of a genealogy buff and knows a lot more about Yitzraelim genealogy as we've gone down through the world. Now we're going to start studying. There's been a time period gap between the end of Bashiri and the beginning of Shemot of about 400 years. Okay, and it's hard to calculate. There's 430 years from between going into Mitzrayim and leaving Mitzrayim. And so now we're going to look at what transpired, get kind of a synopsis of what transpired there in that 430-year time period. But we don't know exactly when the captivity started. Okay, there are several scholarly estimates about how long they were free and when they became captive and how many years they were actually captive. And some of that comes from the Abrahamic prophecy. Abraham was told in a vision certain calculations of numbers of years, but scholars disagree over how many years of it was captivity and how many years of it they were living in Israel. I have my opinion, but I'm going to encourage you just to go back and study that as we're going through this. Go back to Bashirit and study that prophecy, and you can come to what you think it is, because we don't actually know an exact number of years for each part of it. Okay, so in Shemot it says, these are the names of Bnai Yisrael, who came to Mitzrayim with Yaakov, each coming with his household. Reuben, Shimeon, Levi, and Yahudah. Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Ashur. The total number of persons that were of Yaakov's issue came to 70. Yosef being already in Mitzrayim. Now, there's a couple of important things there. Number one, people read this and they gloss over it and they say, oh, 70 people came down. And I used to say this too years ago, and I really read it in the context, and I studied out the Hebrew, and I realized I wasn't getting exactly what it was saying there. And I go back and look at it. It says 70 people were of his issue, Yosef already being in Mitzrayim. Okay, and then people are going to say I'm hair splitting on this, but I think we need to read the word for what it says. If Yosef was already in Mitzrayim, that means that Yosef's sons were already in Mitzrayim. Okay, and that's 3. And they are of what? They are of Israel's, Yaakov's issue. Okay, they were already there. So if you take 3 from 70, it's 67. So 67 people actually came out of the promised land and into Mitzrayim as a group. 3 were already there. Okay? Hair splitting? Maybe. But I think it's important that we concentrate on always reading the word for what it actually says, because although in this case it's hair splitting, does it really matter? Is there anything salvational, sanctification wise? Is there anything that, whether it was 70 or 67, does that really make a difference to our faith? No. But there are things all through Scripture that if we don't read it that closely, we gloss over it and we get the facts wrong, it can be a matter of sanctification. Does that make sense? Okay. Next thing I want you to look at, and it's interesting that this was in today's study, and I didn't plan it this way. Like I said, I did the recording, finished the recordings on Bashiri and went into Shemot now, and that was planned. This is where we would have been months ago had the virus not happened. But because of the virus and the fact that we were just shut down for so long, the things that I talked about earlier, we never started into Shemot. Okay? Just yesterday, my sister-in-law came to me and was asking me about how the bloodline of Israel is traced. Okay? Because she's been studying on it and she was reading and she was wanting to know then, what about, if your father was Jewish but your mother wasn't, and yada yada. And I explained to her how that started. I looked at the history, the dates. It was actually not until the first century BCE that became a custom. And I went through. There's some horrible things having to do with warfare and raping of women. And the women turned up pregnant, and they didn't know who the father was, and the father was a Gentile. And because Torah indicates that genealogy is traced through the father, the offspring were not being counted as being members of the house of Israel. And a very wise rabbi made a very wise judgment, and he said, if the mother is Jewish, the children are Jewish. Somewhere along the line, generations later, that got turned around into only if the mother is Jewish is the child Jewish, and that was never intended. And one of the proofs of that is that if you look here, these are the names of Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Israel, not the daughters. Okay, we don't trace in Torah, we don't trace the genealogy. That if your mother was Jewish and your father isn't, that you can't be Jewish? No, it doesn't mean that. The only things you're ever going to run into in Torah where it says that you have to trace it through the father is if you're tracing the lineage to be king or if you're tracing the lineage to be priest. Kings and priests have to trace their lineage through the father. Okay? And then people say, well, but we're supposed to be kings and priests of the nations. Right. And we have a father, Abba, Yehovah Elohim. Okay? That's how that works. We are his spiritual seed. Again, you can get into hair splitting. Say, well, only the mother was, or only the father was. Okay? There's this great, was trying yesterday, and I tried to look it up, and I couldn't find it. There's this great genealogy discussion group out there for Jewish people, and their slogan is, their tagline on their website is, "We don't care which half of you is Jewish." Okay? And I really think as a people, we need to adopt that. And I'm getting kind of off the subject here, but I thought it was interesting that she asked me that question yesterday. And this morning I opened up Torah to read the next portion to see what I was going to teach on today. And it has part of the answer in there. Yosef died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. Okay? So Yosef and his brothers were the generation. Okay? And that used to throw me off. I was like, okay, so he said Yosef and his brothers and all the generation. And what I didn't understand is that the Hebrew here for generation doesn't just necessarily mean that all of my children are one generation and I'm a generation. Okay? It can also just mean a people group. Okay? A people group who is ethnically, genetically, one. Okay, so if we were looking at this today, I and my 6 children could be counted in this context as a generation because we are one genetic group. The other people here would not be part of that genetic group, even though if you look at everybody here genetically, we're all of Israel. Does that make sense? They were talking about that close-knit family. But the Yisraelim were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, so that the land was filled with them. It's interesting. I had a conversation a month or so ago with a lady here in Du Bois County where everybody says they're German. And you look at the last names, and if you know anything at all about Ashkenazi heritage, you're like, they're Jewish, they're Jewish, they're Jewish, and they're not observantly Jewish, they're not religiously Jewish, but they are of Israel. They're Yisraelim. And you can see it in the name if you know what you're looking for. And so I was talking to this woman who thought she might possibly have, when I first met her, she might possibly have some Jewish heritage. She had kind of heard it whispered about in her family, but she wasn't sure. And I said, well, what's the family name? She said, Jacob. I was like, yeah, you're Jewish. She's like, what? How do you know? I was like, trust me, if your family name's Jacob, there's not a very good chance that you're not Jewish, okay, ethnically. Okay, since then she's been doing some research, and we think we found the connection. But she said, as I was telling her, explaining to her that there are a lot of people in this area who don't know that they have genetic Jewish roots, she said, sometimes I get the feeling there's just Jews everywhere. And as soon as she said that, I thought about this passage. Okay, when it says that they were prolific and they filled the whole land. But the sad thing is that during the time period that we're talking about, during this 430-year period, somewhere along the line, they started to forget what that meant. Because we're going to see a few chapters down the road, you're going to see that there were ethnic Jews, Yisraelim, who did not know what it meant to be a son of Abraham. Okay, who did not know the covenantal God of Yisrael, the Elohim, who said, let there be light, and there was light. Separated light from darkness and made day and night. They didn't know that because they had fallen in with the world. And for them, the world was Mitzrayim and all of the cultures that were coming to Mitzrayim because it was a world superpower of its time. You know what? There are Jews everywhere. Just like that lady told me. There are Jews everywhere, and here we are again in the same situation. We could change the name from United States of America to Mitzrayim, and we would see the same situation where most of the ethnic Jews here don't know what that means. Even if they know they're ethnically Jewish, they don't know the covenant. They've lost it, and they're in bondage. I don't feel that I'm in bondage. Why? Because I'm bound to something greater. Everyone sitting in this building right now should not feel that we're in bondage because we're bound to something greater, to someone greater than all the powers of this world. But we have brothers and sisters. We have a generation that is ethnically bound to us who are not bound to him. And they surround us every day. And they're part of that mixed multitude that we're going to read about in coming chapters. Why was there a mixed multitude? It came out of Mitzrayim. We'll study on that. But a large part of it was because they had forgotten who they were. And they had to start unlearning the culture of Mitzrayim. So the new king arose over Mitzrayim and did not know Yosef. And he said to his people, look, the Israelim are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground. So they set up taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out, so that the Mitzrayim came to dread the Israelim. In the Hebrew there, it doesn't actually say the Mitzrayim came to dread the Israelim. It says they. Put in by the Jewish Publication Society for clarification. I'm not saying that that's necessarily a wrong clarification, but I always like to point that out that that's not strictly what the word says. And I wonder also when it says they, because we don't know how many generations it was, how many years it was between when we came into the land and when this happened. We could be talking about a mixed multitude already, that there were people who were looking at the observant Jews, the observant Israelim, and were afraid of them, who may have even had some blood of Israelim, or blood of Israel, in their veins. Throughout our history, I gave a talk on this a few years ago. Throughout our history, as a people, we have always remained small. Mashiach said that his would be a little flock, quote unquote. Okay, and the churches like to say, well, that's our church because we're such a small number. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the Jewish people. A Mashiach is Jewish. It has to be, or he's disqualified from being Mashiach. Throughout history, we have always been a minority. I believe, and a lot of scholars, even non-Jewish scholars, believe that we are the most oppressed minority in the history of the world. We are something like 0.02% of the world's population, and yet, and we're hated, and we're hated for things like, they say there must be some sort of conspiracy. That's why we've earned 20% of the Nobel Prizes in history. Isn't that a bit disproportionate? Okay, why they ask all these things? Why are they can't just be luck that the Jews are as a people survived this and went through this and lived through it, and they can't just be luck that the Jews accomplished this. No, it's not luck; it's blessings. But the world doesn't understand that. The world believes in luck. Observant Jews believe in blessings. Okay, I was sharing earlier about what happened to me the last 2 days, and the world would call that terrible luck. And I told you the blessings that came moments after each one of those hardships, each one of those trials. He immediately turned it around into a blessing. We just have to be open to seeing the blessing. Okay, but one of the things that Satan has done, Hasatan has done throughout the generations, we point to the Holocaust, and we point to different things, the diaspora, and we point to all of these horrible things that have happened, that so many innocent Jewish lives have been taken, and our number has been kept small. Sometimes I think our number has been kept small. In some ways, it's because the majority of the Jewish people throughout history have abandoned the Torah, and it's been a remnant that has come down through. And so, therefore, when we're talking about that small number, we're actually talking about the remnant, not necessarily everyone who has Jewish blood, because a lot of them don't even realize they do. But the reason, part of that is because he's not going to bless those who aren't doing his will, okay, and who aren't being a blessing to the name of Yisrael. The part of it also, I think, is because the world in its current state could not handle the level of blessing that would come to it through B'nai Yisrael if we were any larger. Okay, look at the good that is done. Look at the physical. Look at Eretz Yisrael, the physical land of Israel right now. Less than a century ago, it was a piece of sand. Not like a grain of sand. I mean, it was a piece of land. You couldn't distinguish it from any other arid piece of land. It was dry, parched, and all the major water sources around it that they could possibly irrigate from were at least somewhat, if not toxically salty. And we were told, as a people, go back to your homeland. You can have it. The United Nations graciously gave us, yeah, right. They acknowledged our birthright and told us we could go home. Less than a century later, if you fly over the Middle East today, what you see is one large mass of sand and rock where almost nothing grows, and right in the middle of it is this emerald green, beautiful oasis called the State of Israel. If you've never flown over it, I've only seen video of flying over it. I've seen pictures of from above. If you've never taken a look at that, it is a testament to whatever we touch. If we are blessing him, he will bless that through us. Whatever we do, my son is having a problem right now. He has an anti-Semitic superior. Y'all know he's in the Marine Corps. He has an anti-Semitic superior who disdained him from the day he walked in. And Yaakov couldn't understand why this guy hated him so much. Until one of his buddies in the unit said, when you're not around, he's making anti-Semitic jokes and he's putting you down for your yarmulke and he's doing all these things. And I didn't know about this until yesterday, and Jacob texted me about it, and he said, I found out that not everybody here likes me. I said, you know what? I made a little joke. I said, I've never yet had a job where everybody liked me, and I was once self-employed, so that says a lot. because I was the only person there to dislike myself. And he got a good laugh out of that. And then he starts telling me this problem, right? And he says, Dad, he even condemns the way I sweep the floor. And I said, the result, the right thing to do with that, I said, is don't even think about him. Don't think about him and his opinion, because he is dead set on finding something wrong with everything you do because he's an anti-Semite. Don't sweep the floor for his satisfaction, sweep the floor for his salvation. And Jacob's like, what are you talking about? I said, does Scripture or does it not say, whatever you do it for the glory of Elohim? Okay? That man hates Jews, probably never knew one until he knew you. Certainly probably never knew one as observant as you. When you go sweep that floor, Yaakov, I told him, I said, I want you to sweep the floor like that man's sanctification depends on it. Because you have an opportunity to show him through your work ethic and through the blessings that will come down on your unit for your observance. You have a means of showing him the glory of Elohim. I said, no, go sweep that floor and sweep it for Elohim and for your sergeant's sanctification. I pray that that unit will be so blessed by my son's presence that his sergeant will have no choice but to see the wonders of this covenant and to desire that for himself, and that his heart will be changed. That is my prayer. But you know what I think? I don't think that sergeant could handle I don't think he could handle having 2 observant Jews in his unit sweeping the floor for his sanctification. I think it would be too much for him to handle. I long for the day when the world is ready, when we have Tikkun Olam, when we have the new world has come, when we have a kingdom reigned over by Mashiach. I long for the day when the Gentiles who looked to the glory of him and wanted to be called by the name of Yisrael can cling to truth and can go up to the new Jerusalem for the for the holy days. They can go up for Sukkot and they can build a sukkah for themselves and worship alongside us. I long for that day, but until then, we're going to be that little flock. The Mitzrayim ruthlessly imposed upon the Yisraelim the various labors that they made them perform. Ruthlessly, twice now they've been ruthless to us, they made life bitter for them with harsh labor at mortar and bricks and with all sorts of tasks in the field. The king of Mitzrayim spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Pua. The other one Pua, saying, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. Okay, so literally, when you're sitting there ready to deliver the baby, while you're still sitting there catching the baby, before the baby is even fully delivered, if it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, fearing Elohim, did not do as the king of Mitzrayim had told them. They let the boys live. This is a verse which has caused a great deal over the years, a huge amount of debate among scholars, because some people say, so we don't have to listen to the king, the governor, the president, the mayor, because we're of Elohim. We're his people. We're not even citizens of it. I mean, right over here in Jasper, there's a church that says we don't listen to the world's government because we're not citizens of the world's government. We're citizens of the kingdom. I don't know how that can be reconciled with the fact that we're commanded to honor and obey the authorities that are put over us. And some groups will say, well, that's referring to religious. Now, no, because it talks about kings and rulers. It's not talking about your rabbi or your preacher. It's talking about, in this country, elected officials or appointed officials. In other countries, people have inherited leadership roles, or whatever the situation is. However, the country you live in comes into having their leadership. But then you have this other extreme that says, well, yes, the Bible says this, but that was for that time. And today we have this law that man made. And to some degree, this is something every believer has to wrestle out for him or herself. Okay? But I'm going to tell you what I've come to, and I'm going to challenge you to pray about it. Here's what I do. I make a careful study of the law of Yehovah, what Moshe gave us when he came down from the mountain. Okay, and as we traveled. I study it thoroughly. I do the same thing with man's law. And I acknowledge man's law. We talked about the mask mandate. Okay? Did I think the mask mandate was ridiculous? Yes. But I also think that I can be an observant Jew and be faithful to Elohim and wear a mask. So if I go into my workplace or I go into a hospital to see a client or what have you, I put on a mask because it doesn't prevent me from honoring Yehovah. In fact, not wearing a mask in this situation, might prevent me from it because I've been able to witness to people while wearing a mask that I couldn't have talked to if I didn't put the mask on. And this is just one, I would say, silly little law. Okay? But I'll tell you what, if they say, put on this mask and go in the building, and don't you dare, and they do this in some places, in some situations, don't you dare talk to them about your God. And I walk in there and I'm wearing the mask and I see the opportunity. Guess what I talk about? Was there still a mask mandate going on during Sukkot? Yes, but we weren't in that level 1 thing where we didn't gather as a congregation for Pesach because we couldn't meet the requirements. Everybody can do Pesach at home. Okay? The commandment is to do it at home, but our congregation is so small that most years we do it together. Okay? Because any one of our households couldn't eat the whole lamb. Okay? So at Pesach, we didn't get together. Everybody could celebrate at home. Sukkot came around and we were farther through the opening up of things, and it wasn't as strict, and we had Sukkot together. But if we couldn't have, my family still would have done Sukkot. Why? Because it's the commandment. Had they come along and said, you can't even be out there doing Sukkot, it's against the law, then I would have to say I'm going to defer to a higher law. I'm going to keep Sukkot. These midwives were not ignoring the commandment of the king because it was, or the command of the king because it was the command of the king and they didn't respect the king's authority. They went against the command only because it would have been a violation of the law of Elohim. And the law of Elohim is very clear about this point. No matter what the commandment is, the sanctity of life is supreme. Mashiach told the story, or used the reference. He said, which one of you, if you're walking along on the Sabbath day, I'm paraphrasing here, which one of you on the Sabbath day would see a beast of burden? It gets translated differently. I think some say ox, some say, they have different translations in English. You see a beast of burden down in the pit on the Sabbath day, and it's going to die in that pit. Which one of you doesn't pull that out? Of course you do, because the life, even of that beast, it's a sanctified thing. It's a creation that we are commanded before all other things. We were commanded to be the keepers of His creation. Okay, it'd be different if they said, "Hey, it's not Sabbath, and today we're gonna kill this steer and eat it." Okay, that's part of the purpose that we were given. Dominion over the earth. We can feed ourselves with it, but if it's just falling in the pit or wallowing around or something, and of course we pull it out. That's the same principle here. They were commanded to kill what Elohim mandated. They were there by their calling as midwives to make sure that child and its mother lived. And so they feared Elohim, and they resigned themselves to the fact that His law is superior, and if the two conflict, we're going to honor Elohim and let Him work it all out. So the king of Mitzrayim summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing, letting the boys live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Mitzrayim women. They are vigorous. Before the midwives can come to them, they have given birth." Here's another one that causes a lot of scholars to debate. These midwives just lied to the king. Because in the previous text, or however we're reading, that's not what happened. They caught the babies coming out. They said, "Oh, it's a boy. Say a Hebrew blessing. Move along." And here they're telling Pharaoh, "Oh, we get there and the baby's already born." I've wrestled with that for a long time. I wrestled with a lot of things. I wrestled with David and Bathsheba. Okay? Both before and after the incident with Bathsheba, David is called a man after Elohim's own heart. Well, think about that. The king of Yisrael sinned in such a way that the entire nation knew his sin. He had violated the Decalogue, as they call it, one of the Ten Commandments, the so-called Ten Commandments out of the 613. This means there's 603 that most people don't know are there, but that's a whole other message. He violated the commandment against adultery. He conceived a child with another man's wife. He tried to deceive the other man into thinking the child was his own. And then he had the other man killed to try to cover up his sin. And yet he was called a man after the heart of Elohim. And I wrestled with that for a long time, and I still kind of do. But if it's in Scripture, I've resolved myself, it's in Scripture, it's true. And I prayed for a long time, God explained this to me, help me understand how this can be. And how can these two midwives not be sinning against the king by lying to him? Why didn't they just say, hey, we fear power much superior to yours, to you, your authority superior to you. Kill us if you have to, but we're not killing these little boys. Why didn't they handle it that way? I heard a message by an old rabbi about a month ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, about what is the true definition of righteousness. And I'm not sure I 100% agree with him, so I'm not going to go into the exact explanation that he gave. But I walked away with at least the understanding that I did not fully understand righteousness before that. Okay? Because his argument, he didn't go into this situation. He went into the David and Bathsheba thing. And he talked about the overall, because as human beings, we are imperfect. And Elohim knows that we are imperfect and that we are flawed. And if he judged us absolutely for all of our wrong, none of us would ever stand in the kingdom. Okay, this wasn't even a Messianic rabbi. This was a Orthodox, I believe, Orthodox or conservative rabbi. And he talked about Elohim looking at the general intent, not of your action in the moment, but of your action in your life. And he argued that David, throughout the majority of his life, his heart was right, and that in a moment of weakness, he sinned. And in his shame, he sinned more. And that when it was all said and done, what he could make right on it, he made right. Which wasn't everything. He couldn't give Uriah back his life. He couldn't undo a lot of the things that he had done. But what he could fix and make right, he did make right. And that Elohim saw, I guess I am going into the other rabbi's message, and that Elohim saw that his intent was such that if he could undo those other things, that he would have undone them. Now, I don't know about these two midwives. I don't know if they walked out and said, gee whiz, we just lied to the king about why we did this righteous thing, why we went against his law. And I don't know, maybe it doesn't say, maybe they went back and corrected it, or maybe they were just sorrowful that they handled it in a less than perfect manner. And Elohim saw that, because what we see is, it says, and Elohim dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. He dealt well with them. So somehow in there, he saw the righteousness of their saving those children as being greater than the sin of their lying to the king. Now, some people are going to say, oh, you're preaching a work sanctification. No. I believe that the good works manifest from sanctification, not that sanctification manifests from good works. But somewhere in here, somewhere in that whole formulaic setup there must be room for him to look and say, your intent is to make right your wrong. And even though you can't physically do it, for whatever reason, the intent of your heart outweighs the actions of your thoughtlessness. And because the midwives feared Elohim, he established households for them. You see that? He dealt well with them. He increased the people, and then he went back to the midwives, and he blessed them more for their righteous work. Then Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Why? Why would he say, kill every boy, let the girls live? Remember at the beginning I was talking about, if your mother is Jewish, even though Torah says trace stuff through your father, if your mother is Jewish, we should accept you anyway. And I explained the argument behind that and whatever. But let me tell you something. And I don't remember the exact statistics off the top of my head. I wasn't planning on going here, but I'm going to talk about it for a minute. Statistically speaking, a child who grows up without a father, and this is today's society, you are statistically, if you grow up without a father or if your father is absent from your life, you are statistically more likely to not be a productive adult. You're statistically more likely to live in poverty most of your life, because there's no such thing as generational wealth in a broken home. At least it's extremely rare. If you grow up without a father, you are more likely to be incarcerated at some point or to be institutionalized. You are more likely, statistically, to not be able to hold together a nuclear, and I know the nuclear family is not exactly popular in our culture today, but it is extremely important. I did a study with 301 participants when I was working in corrections, doing mental health there, and I interviewed the 301 participants. Those participants had to have a felony on their record. That was the one stipulation. Because once you have a felony in our society, you lose so much. You lose the right to vote. You lose certain constitutional rights. You lose the ability to get all kinds of things. In some states, you can't get financial aid, so you can't finish your education. You can't get government housing if you get out of prison and you have no income because you haven't had a job for 10 years or whatever, but you can't get government housing, so you're homeless. So you get desperate, and not saying it's right, but a lot of them turn back to crime because it's a quick way to make a buck, and they end up back in prison. It's just a cycle. Of the 301 participants in the study, 267 of them never knew their father. Most of the others knew their father and had a terrible relationship with him. I can't tell you how many times I would ask about their home life, and I'd say, "How about your father?" And I would hear things like, "I hate that man." Why was the Pharaoh not concerned with killing the girls? Because those girls were going to grow up and be potential wives for the men of Mitzrayim, and the children that they bore. Within one generation, you would have a culture, a whole generation of children who did not know what it was to be an observant Jew, because they would be raised in the homes of fathers who were not Jewish. As men, my father wasn't a good example. And I love my father. I dearly love my father. And now he's older and wiser. I know he regrets some of the choices he made when he was younger. But I was very blessed to have two father figures, two grandfathers, who probably would have fist fought each other over the right to be my mentor, my guide, and teach me right and wrong. And had I not had that, I probably would be the statistic that I just gave you. As men of the Jewish faith, we need to be aware that there's an entire generation of spiritual orphans in this country who long for a man to come alongside them and teach them the things that their father should have.